Scarecrow is my number 2, and we're over to Dan for his number 1. Is that right?
You would think that, but
Adam.
I hate
Adam
to interrupt.
Of course. It's always before I go. Have you noticed that Adam's breaks are always before I go?
Yep.
Well,
I lose my train of thought.
I accidentally telegraphed our guest a little bit by taking a picture of me working on editing the interview.
Adam had a
Sam is the only one that actually zoomed in. The rest of us were
Shocker
like,
that he would do it. Does that mean you know who it is as well, Sam?
Absolutely not. No,
Okay.
I don't know who Mark Kay is.
Okay, good. Our final guest tonight is a guy named Mike Keneally. And Mike is a San Diego guy. And I know him because he was picked to start the San Diego School of Rock. He was Frank Zappa's guitarist. And the guy who started the School of Rock was a Philly guy who worshiped Frank Zappa, met him at a German Zappa festival where he took these kids who can play Zappa, met Mike Keneally and said, hey, I want to start doing School of Rocks in different cities. And would you start the San Diego one? And the San Diego one started in my old office when they couldn't find a building. So Mike and I became friends and wasn't really familiar with his music, him being a avant sort of Zappa freak. But I grew to like him, if only because he's such a nice, sweet guy. And when I went to check him out, I'm like, holy shit, he's revered as one of like a guitar god in many, many circles. But he also happens to be a huge XTC fan. But more importantly, he's recorded music with them in different ways. And it was by far the longest conversation I've had for any of these. So it made it even harder to edit down to something manageable. What these guys are going to hear is 10 minutes. But the finished product will have less than that. But I didn't even get to the fact that he and Andy wrote an album together that is available through Mike's website that is very fun, and you'll have to listen to his whole interview that we're putting up on YouTube to learn about that. But he played on a song that was intended for Oranges and Lemons called My Train Is Coming. It didn't end up there, but and I'm not even sure I named it by name, so that's why I'm saying it right now. But here is my talk with Mr. Mike Keneally. So I'm here with Mike Keneally, and Mike is going to be a guest on our new Beatles podcast called The Quarrelman soon. So we'll get into how we met and all that next time. But in the meantime, Jim has chosen Oranges and Lemons for us to rank. And I thought, okay, I got to get Mike on here to talk XTC a little bit. Tell me what your first memories are of hearing them as a youth.
I have a kind of blurry, imprecise memories of having seen the Making Plans for Nigel video on probably USA Night Flight.
Yes.
Sometime around the time of the album's release, maybe a few months after that album came out. And I remember thinking, well, that's interesting, but not necessarily feeling as though this was something I needed to follow up on. I thought it was cool, but it didn't like make the light bulb go on in my head. But sometime thereafter, I remember reading reviews of Black Sea and being intrigued by the reviews, but not hearing any of the songs, or at least not identifying them. I think later on when I heard like Generals and Majors, I remember thinking, oh, I've heard that song before. I just didn't know who it was. The first time I really experienced the song of theirs and was blown away by it and absolutely identified it as XTC was seeing the video for Senses Working Overtime on MTV.
Probably where I first heard and saw them too.
Okay. So that was, and it wasn't like a super prime viewing spot. It was probably like 1:30 in the afternoon or something. And just falling in love. It was an instantaneous chemical reaction. And then, I started piecing together, these are the guys who did that album Black Sea that all the reviews were foaming about, and then kind of putting the pieces together backward from there. But it was literally just that song, Senses Working Overtime, that set me off, and I remember going to Off the Record on El Cajon Boulevard,
Yes.
and it's just starting to scoop stuff up. And back then you could find imports pretty readily, so I was able to find the UK version of English Settlement. So I got the 2-record version early on, whereas most Americans who didn't dig deep were had to content themselves with the single album version. And I was buying 12 inches and finding all these additional songs, amazing songs that weren't on the albums, and Waxworks and Beeswax and all this. I just everything I could find with XTC on it, I became very obsessive about.
And you were already playing in bands at that point, right? You weren't. That's far along.
Early '80s, yeah. I would say I was just. It's interesting. My sort of musical formative period didn't involve that much live playing initially. My brother and I were both studio rats. We had reel-to-reel multi-track tape recorders, and we were doing our own tapes, and we were like recording a bunch of stuff. That was kind of my musical upbringing, more than having a garage band or going out and doing gigs. But I would say, yeah, around the time that I was getting into XTC, it's when we first started slowly coming out of hiding and getting gigs around town. It was just cover band gigs. I was, just doing top 40 and various bars around San Diego.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we could get an original gig at the Spirit or the Bacchanal, we would take it. But of course, that was, you couldn't make any money doing that. So we were doing cover band stuff, and we were doing frat houses on Montezuma. Around San Diego State.
Two of us went to college there. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, that was our circuit.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I was always more fascinated at that stage by recording than I was by getting on a stage.
Mm-hmm. So when you were making your own music at that point, was it leaning more towards the more out there experimental or Zappa-esque stuff? Is that how you ended up in that world?
Well, I was more trying to make stuff like that maybe when I was a bit younger. At this point, once we were getting into 82, 83, and we were like getting out and starting to do gigs, and then we were making these tapes at home. I was like, I think I was at that point I was trying to temper the insanity, all the prog rock stuff and the Zappa influence stuff, and get gradually more into finding ways to use that stuff in a pop music framework. I was always really interested by bands that had really intricate music, interesting, unpredictable, adventurous music, but found a way to cram that into like a 3-minute song form. And XTC scratched that itch perfectly, because harmonically their stuff was fascinating. They were writing such great chord sequences, and their rhythms were so cool. And I was picking up on what I thought were some really specific influences from like Beefheart and stuff in the way they were doing their 2 guitar arrangements and everything. And so it was validating when I started getting magazines with interviews, and I found out that yes, Andy Partridge was a huge Beefheart fan, and that stuff was indeed a big influence on him. So it was like those flavors that I was picking up on were actually in there, but he was putting all of these different influences in the service of this perfect pop songcraft. Right. And I became obsessive over XTC to a degree I hadn't felt since like the Beatles for a pop band. You know?
I mean, you're basically describing my favorite kind of music, something with a hook, but it gets weird, Right. And they are, for it sounds like for you and me, they're one of the ultimates for stuff like that.
Yeah. It's I would hear other music that was sort of in that realm, and it always kind of felt like, they were just sort of, I'm not going to say pretenders to the throne, because that's mean, but XTC were the king. They're just other bands would be doing interesting stuff in a pop format, but XTC were at the top of it all. There wasn't anybody to compare.
Mm-hmm. So what led to you ending up being in their orbit enough to end up meeting them and doing a little recording with them?
I have specifically one person to thank for that, and that was Scott Tunis, who was the bass player in Frank Zappa's band.
Mm-hmm.
So we were I had managed to luck my way into Frank Zappa's band in late 1987.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be a few years after I became an XTC fan.
Mm-hmm.
So we were in the Zappa band. We rehearsed for 4 months, and then we toured for 4 months. The first 2 months were in the U.S., and then the second 2 months were in the U.K. and Europe. So we're in the UK doing a series of shows in England, and Scott Tunis, the bass player, who's a real character and an amazing force musically and also in my life, he was as big an XTC fan as I was, and we were just kicking around the hotel one day, and he told me, I'm gonna get the number for Virgin Records. I'm gonna call up Virgin Records, and I'm gonna leave a message for XTC and let them know that they're invited to come to the Zappa show.
Nice.
And I just thought this was my first tour, my first professional musical experience of any kind. After playing top 40 in clubs in San Diego, I'm in Frank Zappa's band, and Frank Zappa was my musical hero when I was growing up. So
it's amazing.
It's bizarre that that's where my career started professionally.
How old were you?
I was 25 when I joined the band.
Okay.
26 once we were on the road.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, I just thought, oh, they're just going to think that he's some kind of practical joker, but it worked. He called up Virgin. He said, "Hi, I'm Scott Tunis from the Zappa band, and I'd like to cordially invite anybody from XTC who would like to come to our UK shows, just get in touch and we'll make sure they're on the guest list."
Uh-huh.
And I figured that would be the end of it, because at that point I knew enough about Andy to know that he not only was he not playing shows, he wasn't even like leaving his house. He really wasn't he wasn't socializing much.
Right.
But Andy Partridge and Dave Gregory came to see us in Birmingham.
Would that be the closest for them in just Swindon, or they just decided that's where they were going to go? I was waiting for you to mention Swindon, but
well, we didn't do any gigs in Swindon on that tour.
Of course,
I don't know if there were any venues that would have been appropriate, but it totally worked. We played Wembley Arena on that tour. We played a number of UK venues, but I guess geographically, you're asking the wrong guy, but I guess geographically that Birmingham and Swindon were close enough.
Fair enough.
For them to decide to make the trip.
Right.
And again, it was like not this was not in character for Andy to like even leave Swindon, much less get in a car and drive to another town to see a show.
Uh-huh.
But Dave, as it turns out, was a huge Zappa fan,
mm-hmm.
and Andy was never as much of a Zappa enthusiast as he was, say, a Beefheart enthusiast, but he definitely had respect and admiration and was intrigued enough to want to make the trip.
That's
so
great.
They came to the show, and it was quite astonishing, and it was a little daunting for me to get off stage and walk back into the green room area, and there's Andy and Dave,
Yes.
and I just I was all ready to be very intimidated, but they were such and remain such lovely people, and so easy to spend time with, and so easy to talk to, and just normal guys that they instantly put me at my ease. Scott Tunis has no trouble being put at ease. He's always at his ease.
Uh-huh.
So he didn't require any special conditioning, but I was like, I was ready to be. Plus, it was my first tour of any kind. I hadn't met that many people that I admired in the music business.
Wow.
At that point, there were, like the first famous person I ever met was Frank Zappa, and then I was in his band. So I was still young enough and green enough to be pretty,
starstruck, basically.
Yeah, absolutely starstruck. But these guys were just so sweet and so complimentary, and they enjoyed the show very, very much. And they had the briefest interaction with Frank as Frank was leaving the building, because Frank usually traveled separately from the rest of the band, and so he was kind of breezing down the hallway past us, and Scott stopped him, and he said, "Scott, I'd like you to meet this is Andy Partridge and Dave Gregory from XTC," and to this day, Andy Partridge will swear that Frank Zappa looked at him, said "mup," and walked out of the building.
As in the word M-U-P.
Exactly. That's
Okay.
even the proper spelling. He says, he will tell you, Frank looked at me, said "mup," and then walked out of the building.
That's so funny, because I was gonna say, if you didn't, I said, was there any interaction? Would that have registered a blip? I was gonna say the word blip, and he said mup.
It registered a mup.
So great. So that was around 1987.
That was 88. That would have been
88.
like April of 88. Yeah.
Okay.
I joined the band in late 87, but we literally rehearsed for 4 months, and then we toured for 4 months, and then that was it for that band.
Okay.
But during the course of the conversation, Andy and Dave mentioned that the following year, no, it would be later that year, that they were going to be in Los Angeles making this new album. They already knew at that point that they were going to record in LA.
Mm-hmm.
And they invited us to come hang out with them in the studio while they were making this record.
Mm-hmm.
So that became my reason for existing for several months, and I was still, it was easier for Scott because he lived in LA. So he basically was hanging out there more often than I was, but I was down in San Diego, and so I would just make these pilgrimage up there. Sometimes my wife at the time, Viv, would come up, and sometimes my brother Marty would come up with me. Sometimes it would just be me. And Geffen Records had rented them out these like townhouses at a place called the Oakwood on Barham. The buildings are still there, but it's not called the Oakwood anymore. But that was their home for the months that they were working on that album, and often Andy's family was there, Colin's family was there. So, but Dave was just on his own. So I would, if I was there on my own, I would come up and stay in Dave's condo with him.
Mm-hmm.
So Dave was the guy that I was closest with, because I was, we were hanging out a lot together. I was staying at his place. And then I would just travel to the studio with them and just like hang out. It was the best, and I loved the songs so much. I think that Oranges and Lemons is an amazing bunch of tunes. It's just a great repository of wonderful material. And watching these songs come to life was just it was a dream. I couldn't believe it.
It seems like maybe that they were taking their previous stuff, and they'd sort of gone, there's some songs that are sort of in that direction, but there are songs that remind me of your stuff, of Zappa's stuff a little bit. Well, I mean, the fact, the first track alone, the guitars on Garden of Earthly Delights, I thought might be you, because before I knew you, I had heard, okay, you played on an XTC album is all I had heard as a kid, and that was 20 years ago, and I hadn't bothered to follow up, even though I had the record. And when I went back, I'm like, oh, well, that must be Mike. And so maybe Dave Gregory had like similar, sensibility as you were hanging out with him. He was influenced by some of the same stuff you were, maybe.
Well, I mean, yeah, we definitely have. We don't, we don't align on everything, but we definitely grew up loving a lot of the same stuff. We have several albums in common that are some of our favorite albums. We both love. We both have the same favorite Zappa record, which is "We're Only in It for the Money."
Nice.
We both loved "Inner Visions" by Stevie Wonder. We both loved "Countdown to Ecstasy" by Steely Dan. So we do, whatever it is that created me, also in part created Dave, but I wouldn't. I was too new to their orbit for my music to have had any impact on theirs, but I think that there might have been something in the air, just the fact that Zappa was kind of hanging over the it was just sort of in the same dimension at that time. It was weird because I kind of agree with you. When I listened to Oranges and Lemons, I thought that it was musically a bit more experimental, arguably somewhat more proggy than some of the earlier albums. But also I think Paul Fox had worked with Yes. He had done like some remixes for Yes. So I think some of what you're hearing there is Paul's influence on the thing.
Interesting.
But I just think it was a function of the stuff that Andy and Colin were writing at the time. It was just there's a lot of some really intricate stuff going on there harmonically, and then you combine that with Paul's indulging their every whim in terms of overdubs. So you're getting a lot of interlocking stuff. You're getting a lot of layers. It's definitely a headphone album. It's an album that you dive way into, and you might not necessarily reach the bottom of everything that's there.
Maybe because Skylarking was a little more pop, for lack of a better word, or more classic. Maybe sometimes, like so many people have a reaction to that. Just go, let's go way out there. If the record company or the public wants some more of this, then let's really get out there and indulge just to be contrarian, which they are, so. And if they had just seen Zappa, maybe that was on the brain a little bit, which I love. I love the thought of that.
It's not out of the question, and I can't say I ever really thought of that specifically either. But it is not out of the realm of possibility that the fact that Scott and I were hanging out brought some tinge of Zappa to the atmosphere in the studio.
Tell me about the song that you ended up playing on that. I guess it's on the the expanded versions of the record.
Yeah, well, it's Hiding. If you get the Steven Wilson remix of Oranges and Lemons, which I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but it was it's a CD Blu-ray combo pack, and if you stick in the Blu-ray, you have to go to I think you go to the bonus audio section, and then you navigate to the right, where there doesn't appear to be anything going on, but that takes you to the secret zone where that song "My Train Is Coming" lives.
I think it's on YouTube, if I'm not mistaken.
Is it?
Probably,
it might be.
It was last time I checked, anyway. But these things come and go. So
that's cool. Somebody might have actually ripped it from the Blu-ray and stuck it up there. But that was actually the very first day I was in the studio with them. So at that point, because they did their basic tracks, when Pat Mastelotto was tracking all of his drums, and they were getting like basic guitar and bass tracks, most of which were probably replaced later. But they did the basics at Ocean Way, which is where Pet Sounds was recorded, and I think Elvis Costello was working on the Spike album at the same time that they were working on Oranges and Lemons at the same studio.
Oh wow! I assumed that they were friendly.
I think they passed each other in the hallway, but they weren't like hanging.
Interesting.
So that was the first day in the studio. That I was there and with them in the studio, and they were tracking this tune, "My Train Is Coming," which is of everything that was, and it's the only bonus thing from the sessions as far as I know that wasn't on the album. I might be mistaken about that, but it's my first time in the studio with XTC, and they're doing a number of takes on this like Dave Clark 5 influenced power pop 60s tune, "My Train Is Coming," and Andy's playing rhythm guitar on his Telecaster and singing at the same time, or he's trying to, but he was like feeling inhibited vocally by the fact that he had to play at the same time. So he just says over the mic, I'm sitting in the control room and they're tracking, and he goes, "Mike, you want to come in here and play guitar on this so I can just sing?" And everybody else in the studio is like, "What? Why? What? Mike's
Why
never
not
played
Dave?
this." Well, Dave was playing as well.
Oh, okay.
The whole band is playing live. So this is actually the only time I ever saw XTC live. All playing at the same time. Was sitting in the control room watching them do basic.
Sure.
So they were tracking as a band. Dave and Colin and Pat and Andy were all in separate little areas, but they were all playing live. And Andy was just feeling like he couldn't give the vocal what it needed, so he asked me to come in. And this was an incredible vote of confidence, and I'm not sure why he felt certain that I was going to be able to pick it up without ever having played it. But I'd heard them run through the tune like 3 times, and it's a pretty basic tune. It's not like 1-4-5, but it is a pretty simple tune, and it's very repetitive. And he just
you were watching their hands, like you probably already.
I was checking out what they were doing, but I wasn't thinking in terms of I'm going to have to play this. I had no idea I was going to be asked. I was just sitting there having a fun time. But he felt sure that I could just go in and play it without even running it down. It's just like they're going to do a take and I'm going to play. And the rest of the band is like skeptical. It's like, what? This guy that we've never even heard him play before, and he's going to pick up the guitar and play on the tune. And so and I was feeling very confident because I knew how the song went after hearing it 3 times. I've got a good ear. I'm lucky in that in that regard.
Yes.
And I knew that I was going to be able to play the tune. And so the version that you hear, the version that I guess is on YouTube, the version that's on the Blu-ray is the one and only time I ever played it with them. That's what didn't go on the album, but has ended up on the special edition, and that's Andy's trust in me was not misplaced. And it wasn't like and I even played a little solo on there, which was not the most. It was hard for me to be expressive solo wise using Andy's rhythm guitar tone, which is just like it was like playing a wasp. I
love that phrase.
It definitely works for a slashing rhythm sound, but it's not. And it's Dave, I think, even he commiserated with me afterward. He said playing a solo with that tone wasn't the easiest thing in the world, was it? And I said,
right.
No, it definitely wasn't. But I didn't attempt to do anything too clever. And Colin was very sweet. He had a huge smile on his face. He goes, "Man, burning guitar, man." I was like, "Oh, yeah." So that was nice. And Andy just had a big smile on his face because he knew that his confidence in me was not for naught. So that was.
So they didn't even bother doing another take.
That was it.
Oh, no. One and done.
That was the last take. It was like they said, "Okay, that's we can leave that alone for now."
So great.
I guess they felt like because it's a good rhythm track. If they had decided, they wouldn't necessarily. I don't necessarily harbor any delusions that they would have absolutely kept my track, but they were just there trying to get decent drum tracks. Is really what it was about.
Right.
And
Sure.
and get a good full band vibe, just so that they knew that it was a happening enough track. There was enough energy in the basis of it that if they were to go back and do overdubs on it, that it was a good take to do overdubs on. So once they had gotten that take in the can, they felt like, all right, we're done with that one. So that was cool. But I think what happened ultimately was that they just looked at the songs that they had for the record and realized that this one song kind of sticks out like a sore thumb with everything else, and which is true. It really doesn't thematically, musically, conceptually, whatever, sound of a piece with the same with the rest of the album. That
Fair.
Wouldn't necessarily have been a bad thing. I mean, I think that there's a lot of albums that the variety, look at the White Album,
Sure.
it's like just because all the songs don't sound like they all belong in the same place, that doesn't necessarily mean that's bad.
Right.
But
yeah, it comes up on our podcast sometimes. Like, well, this song doesn't belong, so we might rank it lower, but sometimes that's the thing I love. Like I
Yeah.
love when a band is willing to throw something in the middle of an album that's so different or super short or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
they obviously have a mindset to do that.
my albums are nothing but left turns. So
That is
it's like-
true.
so I'm never afraid of taking a big detour stylistically.
Right.
But I also didn't think that they were wrong not to put that song on the album, and but for whatever reason they chose not to finish it. But I was still delighted to have played with them in the studio, and but like I said, that was, I never got to see a live XTC show. By the time I saw them, they were done, and I always remember feeling pretty regretful about that, because I was living in San Diego where the English Settlement tour ended,
Right.
which
Correct.
was it's like I could have been to that show. The next day was when they went to LA, and Andy suddenly, I wouldn't even say realized, it's just like his entire nervous system and body told him that he couldn't do it
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah. I was gonna say, when you mentioned that it was the only time that you got to see them live, you and I both have friends that love whenever they can to get to mention that they went to the last XTC show, because we're of that age, and so there was a few people in the know that got to go to that show. California Theater, I think.
Yep.
And oh well. Did you know in advance that the song wasn't going to end up on the album, or were you like a kid on Christmas opening it up and looking for the track to be on there, and you saw that it wasn't there, or you had a pretty good idea that it wasn't?
I don't remember, because I remember the day the album came out, and I bought it on all three formats. I got it on vinyl, CD, and cassette.
Uh-huh.
And I remember seeing our names in the special thanks, which was really
that's
lovely.
Great.
And they referred to Marty as the affable Mart, which they in case anybody wondered what that's about. Marty and I had a group called Affable Mort at the time.
Nice.
and so my brother's name is Marty, and they referred to him in the liner notes as the Affable Mart. So that's the secret backstory on that one.
But
I don't have any recollection of being disappointed that My Train Is Coming wasn't on the album. So I must have known. I think because I was in touch with both Andy and Dave. We were back, this is the pre-email days, and
right.
and it was pretty expensive to make phone calls, but we were writing each other letters with some frequency. We were keeping up with each other, just sending snail mail back and forth.
That's so great. I love it.
Yeah.
So between then and 2012, how often did your paths cross?
I didn't see Andy all that often, but I would see Dave with some frequency. Anytime I would go to the UK to do a show with anybody. In the early 90s, I was touring over there with Dweezil's band, and then later on I joined Steve Vai's band in the mid 90s and toured England quite a bit. And whenever Dave was able to come to a show, he would come out. And several times, if I would do a show and then the next day was a day off, I would step out of the tour bubble and go back to Dave's place in Swindon and hang out.
Great.
Just hang out with him for a day or two.
That's so great. I got to drive by a couple of times on our last tour. We played the West Coast, and just even driving by in the dark, I was like, or going with my girlfriend last summer when we went by Swindon. We were just a little aflutter because she loves them too. So it's funny how mythical of a place.
Drive by the Chalk Horse.
Right.
And then he came to the U.S. touring with Amy Mann, and I went to hang out with him there. And then when I would go and hang out at his place, sometimes we would go and visit Andy. So there were numerous times that I was able to connect with them. And then at some point, this was in pretty close to 2008. Which was 20 years after we met, and neither Andy or I can remember who of us suggested it first, which is funny. But somehow the idea just arose, why don't we write songs together? Finally, 20 years
Uh-huh.
after, we've known each other all this time, but we've never actually tried to collaborate.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously by then I had put out a bunch of albums. I had done enough that I had sort of established my own, weird little corner of the underground area of the music business. And he had always been, every time I would do an album, I would send copies to both Andy and Dave, and they would both always be very sweet, very complimentary. And then finally, as I say, one of us said, well, let's try writing together. And that at that point, it's like, well, the only way this is going to happen, for whatever reason, we didn't explore the option of trying to do it remotely.
Mm-hmm.
We said, well, we got to be in the same place at the same time. So was it 2008, or it might have been even earlier? I think it might have been, well, it was two separate periods of getting together and collaborating.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe the first one was actually in 2006. I went over there. I literally went to England specifically to collaborate with Andy.
Mm-hmm.
And then a couple of years later, we had another period. I think I was already going to be in England for some reason, and this time I went there earlier, so that we could get together and work on stuff.
Right.
But so it was about a week-long period in 2006 and another week-long period in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end of those two little songwriting workshop sessions, we had like eight or nine songs.
Uh-huh.
And I had thought, well, let's maybe if we do one more of these, one more week together, then that'll be enough stuff to have an album's worth of songs. But I read an interview with Andy, and somebody asked him in this interview, we heard that you're collaborating with Mike Keneally. What's happening with that project? And he said, I have no idea. I'm waiting for him to finish the album. And I'm like, oh, he is? I didn't know that.
Battling in the press.
Yeah. I thought we were just in the midst of collaboration, because I routinely would have like 2 or 3 album projects going at once. And so it wasn't unheard of for me to like have various things bubbling simultaneously, and sure. I didn't know that there was a that time was running out on Andy's interest in the whole thing. But somebody sent me the link to that interview, and I was like, oh fuck, I better get this thing finished, because we hadn't, we were just writing songs together. We didn't like codify what the project was and where these songs were going to go. Mm-hmm. I didn't know, is this an album we're making together? I didn't want to like place any pressure on him, because I know that he felt weird since the demise of XTC. He felt weird about coming out with an Andy Partridge album, so to speak.
Sure.
I think he just didn't want to invite that much scrutiny.
Sure.
But he'd had several years where he wasn't doing very much writing at all, and he described it as a writer's block. So as a friend and also as a fan, I felt like a certain obligation to try to help with that if I could. I just wanted him to be productive again. Mm-hmm. So I went over there, as I say, on 2 separate occasions to write with him, and he was just so creative, and it wasn't like it was a struggle to get him to come up with stuff. He was just flowing. So it just seemed to me like all he needed was the slightest bit of encouragement, and all of a sudden he's Andy Partridge again. But I think he was feeling kind of stung by just the way the fact that XTC never quite ascended to the ranks of a truly international phenomenon where everybody knows the name, even though hundreds of thousands of people know who they are, respect them, love them. And I think that they have more respect now than they did, let's say, in 2006 when we were starting to write together. So I think
time does that for sure.
I think he was feeling like, what's the point, to some degree. And that
did
made
you
me
both
sad. That made me sad because he's so freaking good.
Right.
if I could, I don't have any issues with my own productivity, but it's in this, it's in this specific kind of abstract realm. I can write pop songs, but they're also like abstract pop songs. But Andy was just this capable of turning out these beautiful gems of like pop perfection. And if I could do that, I would be doing it all the time.
And he probably loved the fact that you could come in and fuck with it to a certain degree.
Well, I mean, it's like he had, for instance, there's a song on the album that we ended up writing together. It's called Wing Beat Fantastic. There's a song on that album called I'm Raining Here Inside. And that was a set of lyrics that he had completed, and he couldn't think of any music to accompany these words. Every time he tried to set these lyrics to some sort of music, he was just stymied. He couldn't come up with anything. And so he had them in a little book, and I sat down at a piano in his front room, and he put the book in front of me, and he said, What does this suggest to you? What does this say to you? And I will swear on any stack of whatevers that within 5 minutes I had written the entire song, and all it took was to look at the words, and I could hear them singing to me. It's like I know exactly what these chords are. I know exactly what this melody is. It's literally as though the song was just hanging there in the living room, and I just reached up and grabbed it.
Wow, that's great. And it immediately reminds me of that bit in the documentary where he, for the hell of it, decides to pick up a guitar, play a random chord, and come up with a song out of it. And you could just see it, his creative process. It was so interesting, and that's why I was curious, like how much of that was happening, where he was just coming up with a tiny bit of an idea, or if you were coming up in with ideas. And it sounds like it can't happen in different combinations.
Every song was its own story, but a lot of them was just like at one point he just goes, okay, play a chord, just like imagine what's the first chord of this song gonna be. Yes. And so I played one chord, and he goes, try another one. And then I finally played a chord that like made something happen. And then he goes, all right, I'll play one a bit higher. And then, I'll play a second chord. He goes, change one of the notes. And I choose a note to change. He goes, yeah. And so, at that point, he's using me like clay, right?
Right.
And so it's obviously it's pretty, the workload is kind of equally divided, because he tells me play a chord, I'm the one choosing what chord to play, but then he decides whether or not to discard that chord or try another one. So he's basically editing me in real time.
But you've also got a much more interesting set of colors to choose from with a guitar in your hands than a lot of guitarists, and I think that's maybe why he had you out.
Well, I mean, he too has a very colorful set of chords and ideas and things at his disposal. So, one thing that was driving me through the whole process was I don't want to waste his time. I want to inspire him. So I was reaching pretty deep to come up with stuff, not like self-consciously clever, not too hoity-toity, not too proggy, but just interesting enough to touch something off in his brain that would make him want to pursue that avenue. So and at every step along the way, we're weighing every chord, every melody note, every lyric, because we were sitting side by side writing lyrics together, which is an unusual process where you're literally weighing every word in a line to see if it belongs there.
Yeah, I mean, I know when I do that, I've always pretty much been alone, and I was curious if you or he had also, like, I can't imagine he did that with XTC, and I don't know if you've done that with your projects.
No, I'd say 99% of my writing has, apart from these songs with Andy, have been just me in solitude. If I do collaborate with people, it's very, especially nowadays, it's much more about sending files, via email and seeing what comes back, and then working with that. Although lately I've been working with this guy in San Diego who I hope you've run into in your travels, a guy named Marcelo Radulovic.
Don't know offhand.
In the 80s, he had my favorite San Diego band, which is a group called Playground Slap.
I've heard of them for years.
Yeah. And he played on my album Wooden Smoke, which came out in 2001. And right now we're collaborating on stuff, 2 albums actually. And one's like an album of songs, for want of a better word, and then another one is an ambient album.
Oh wow!
And we're sending stuff back and forth, but we've also had a couple of days where in the last few weeks I've been in California for other reasons, like at the music awards thing. I was at the San Diego Music Awards, and
congrats!
Thank you. That was late April, and I worked into the schedule the day before that. Or 2 days before that, to go spend a couple of days at Marcelo's place and do some recording with him. So that's real time collaboration. But that's not songwriting. That's not pop songwriting as much as it is experimental sound, throwing paint at the wall, and then carving stuff out of it. That's a different process. It's more impressionistic. With Andy, it was we're trying to write coherent songs that aren't experimental, but like that are classic in some way.
Right. And I love it. I mean, I was listening to it a little earlier because I hadn't in a while, and then I read your description on your website where you can get it still, right?
Yep. It's still in print.
MikeKeneally.com. And in a much more elegant way, you were basically saying that you kind of met halfway, that your ideas are a little more out there, and he's come from this more classic pop, but like that you were influencing each other. So where this might be the most pop thing you've ever done, this might be the most out there thing. Maybe not out there, but
I've noticed. Like he did this thing, Monstrance, with Barry Andrews, which is all improvisational, craziness in a way. So and or his dub experiments, or the stuff with Peter Blegvad, he can get pretty out. And Wingbeat Fantastic is definitely a pop album. But there are several things on that record that are a bit more unusual, but for me it's very settled. And then in order to flesh it out to a full album length, because we'd only written so many songs together before he was ready to say, okay, I'm done with this. So I had to flesh it out with some stuff that I wrote on my own, and then so at that point the challenge was, okay, what can I write on my own that's not going to sound completely in a whole other universe compared to the stuff I wrote with Andy. So even when he wasn't there, he was exerting an influence on what I was writing by myself. And then
what would Andy do?
Yeah, or just it's not necessarily that as much as what would Andy like. Mm-hmm. Like when I was creating that album, I was making it for an audience of one, and that audience was Andy.
So great,
because he it was lovely of him to devote 2 weeks of his time /life /energy /talents to writing these songs with me, and knowing what my sales figures are. He had to know it wasn't going to result in any kind of major windfall for him, but he was incredibly generous, and he was incredibly involved and invested, and then so I was sending him rough mixes as I was, once I realized, okay, Andy's waiting for me to finish this album, I guess it's on me. This is not going to be a Mike Keneally / Andy Partridge collaboration in the recording studio. This is going to be a Mike Keneally album using the material that we've written together, and have that be the basis of the album, but in fortified by these other things that I did by myself. And I was sending him rough mixes of all the songs in progress, and he's sending me back very exhaustive emails with his with his input and his suggestions and his advice. So even while we were separated by an ocean, he was effectively co-producing. He was giving me a lot of very needed input. And so even after the initial songwriting phase, he was helping shape what that album eventually became.
Wow, that's so fantastic. Well, it came out great. I can't recommend it enough, and I'm hoping that because I've turned it on, I turned people on to it that didn't know about it, and I hopefully this will do some more. So cool. I'm gonna let you go, but I have to ask the big question. When we did Skylarking last year, I think I reached out to you really, really late, and you demurred. It's like, I can't pick a favorite on this record, but that's all we do. So if you even if you pick a few favorites, but if you generally have what you consider to be a favorite song on Oranges and Lemons, we want to know. Inquiring minds.
Okay, well, there are two that are battling it out for the top spot.
All right,
and those are probably the top. If you held the proverbial gun to my head and said you got to pick one, it's probably Chalk Hills and Children.
Nice.
And but just hanging around, dancing around it's coattails is Scarecrow People, which I think is just a brilliant song.
Yeah, excellent.
But I also have great fondness, and I got to give props to Colin, because I think One of the Millions is might be my favorite Colin Moulding song. I think that's
okay, interesting. Yeah, I'm really curious to hear how everyone else is ranking it. We're doing it in 3 days, and it's so funny to talk to someone else, because we're always very let's not talk too much about it, save it for the pod. So just to talk to someone for 2 seconds about it and hear what your favorites are, it's great. So thanks for taking time to talk to me, and
of course, really
and we'll
pleasure.
talk about the Beatles fairly soon once you get done with 4 months of touring. Apparently, holy moly! Be safe out there, and we'll talk soon.
Right on. Thanks.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks for your patience, boys.
That was great. That was our guests are better than the hosts. Let's have more guests.
Yeah, I know. These are 2 really good ones. So, and like I said, it killed me to edit it down that much, but there will be more editing, and for anyone who's interested, almost everything he has to say is so fascinating, and is about 50 minutes of us chatting, and he could have been nice.
50 or 15?
50 minutes.
Wow.
Like I said, he did an album with Andy where he went to Swindon, and they basically wrote 8 songs or close to 8 songs together, and then without really like cementing exactly what they would turn into, Andy let him record everything on his own. So they wrote the songs together, and then Mike recorded everything. So Andy doesn't actually play on it, but it sounds like total Andy Partridge stuff. And Mike likes to say that he made his avant-garde a little more pop, and vice versa, with Andy getting a little more out there, by having Mike Keneally, who's entrenched in Zappaism, but he can play anything to be a soundboard. So it was really interesting, and especially at a time when XTC has barely done anything. To put this out was really, really fantastic. So can't recommend it enough.
I mean, I thought working at Tower on Sunset was my dream, but watching XTC, it's one thing to come in and hear the playback, like Gary said, but screw that now. I want to actually watch them fucking recording in the studio, let alone getting pulled in and playing with them. That I'm not even daring to go that far, but watching them put one of these songs together, even one, would be unbelievable. What a story.
And I edited out so much fun stuff that he got to really hang out with them and spend and stay with them. Basically, they rented apartments for them, and he would go up and stay with Dave Gregory, because the other 2 had their families with them, and sounds like they would just like chat about guitars all night. It's just perfect.
Heaven.
And my other favorite part of that interview was Adam saying, "Could you just pick one? Because that's all we do." Well put, Adam. Well put.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really short podcast if you just pick one song.
It's right there. It's right there in the name.
Yeah. So he has Chalk Hills at number 1. Dan, what's your number 1?
Jim, you tell me. You seem to know. What is my number 1?
It's Scarecrow People.